Anthropic just released its Claude Sonnet 4.5, and alongside it, it released a system card including a load of safety data, which buried inside of that was something fascinating, interesting, and maybe even a little bit unsettling. And that's that the model realized that it was being tested and changed its answers based on that. Which begs the question, if AI can detect and change its behavior, how much can we trust the way we actually measure safety? I'm Christopher Lind, and this is Future Focused. And today we're bridging the gap between business, technology, and people by focusing specifically on Anthropic's new system card and specifically the safety data and what it actually tells us about trust. So, if this helps you think differently, I'd encourage you to please tap like, subscribe, share it with a friend, and if it's also helpful, you're welcome to support me financially by buying me a coffee at christopherlin.com/buymeacoffee. Okay, now before we get into this, I do want to do some context setting. I'm not going to go into a deep dive here since I know many of you follow a lot of my stuff, but I know some of you are new here. Now, if you aren't aware what Anthropic's system card is, it's something that they do on their own accord as part of their model development. And it's a public report that comes out with each new model. And it's a mix of the report card of model performance alongside what their safety lab team or their safety team put together describing all this stuff. It's a doozy, just so you know. The whole thing's like 149 pages, something like that. And you can go through and you can look at all that. You can see all the different things that they cover, the way they look at safety, whether it's the benchmarks, the red teaming, refusal behavior, like when does it refuse? Does it give false positives? Potential for misuse. And then one of the things that we're going to be focusing on today is this idea of evaluation awareness. Now, I would highly recommend if you like learning more about this, because I'm not doing a deep dive on the safety card or system card itself. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I really want to focus on the implications of this whole evaluation awareness and what it means for you. But I would highly encourage you to. It's freely available. You can go to Anthropic's site. If you just Google Anthropic 4.5 Sonnet safety card, you'll see it. It's a PDF. You can go through it and look at all that stuff. And I would encourage you to. It just helps you better understand this stuff. But that's what this is about, and we're going to dig into this. And I really want to focus on something that stood out, because what really stood out to me wasn't necessarily a chart in there or some of the comparison benchmark data for its model performance and all of this. It was the fact that the model sometimes, to be fair, not all the time, or at least documented that we were able to recognize, could tell it was being tested and behaved differently. So to go into that, there were 3 insights related to that I'm going to unpack and just share with you about what that looks like. But then I'm also going to go into so what, Christopher? Like what should I do differently, knowing that sometimes AI models may or may not be able to detect when they're being assessed as part of routine testing and things like that. Okay, so with that, let's start with the first insight, which is we have to be so careful where we put our trust with things like these safety cards or these system cards or any sort of research reports, things like that. You see a benchmark report that comes out, because benchmarks and internal testing does not always, and many times I would say never really, equates reality. And so you have to take these things as something that you can look at, but not necessarily something that you just execute decisions based off. And what I mean by that is this whole awareness of being evaluated opens up a little bit of Pandora's box. And that if you actually look at the data, and it starts, by the way, on out of the 149 pages, the whole safety piece, or this evaluation, the safety piece starts before, but the evaluation awareness starts on page 58, I think is where it is. And what you'll find in there is that 13% of the time, the automated test transcripts showed that it was aware and it altered its behavior based on that awareness. So its response was influenced by that. Now, I'm not intending to, ring alarm bells or all that, but what I would want to say is be careful you don't just write that off. 13% is significant. Like that's more than 1 in 10. And what I mean by that is like, think about this on a practical scale. Okay. If you're a teacher and you give a test and your students always perform different or they act different when you give a test, or if they're being watched, or if you're a leader and you show up at the office and boy, everybody really is awfully compliant when you're there and you don't see any of the issues that you would normally see. The behavior is always the people are on top of their game. And it's because people know when they're being evaluated. And so if AI knows it's being tested, it's not necessarily showing us what it is. It's showing us what we want to see. And I think it's being really aware of that, not freaking out about it, not throwing AI out the window with it, but saying, okay, there's at least evidence that it routinely can pick up on this. Now, to be clear, if you go into the depth of it, you'll see they're like, this is not like where it showed up. A pretty aware human would probably be able to detect this. So it's not exercising some superhuman judgment and it can nefariously detect, when you're pulsing it for certain things. But this is what we were able to pick up on also. So, and if you really think about it, because this is not about sentience, and sometimes it gets into that. This is not about sentience in that if you think about evaluation, it's about picking up on patterns. And going back to my example of a boss showing up at the office, there's a distinct pattern when a boss who maybe hasn't left their office in forever suddenly starts walking around asking their employees questions. There's a pattern to that. People see the normal pattern, then they see this new pattern and go, this is different. And we pick up on that because there's patterns to it. AI picks up on patterns. As a result, it can pick up on these patterns. And so I think what that means, though, is we need to be aware it sees those patterns. And so if it knows we're testing it for something, it's going to be inclined to behave a little bit differently than it would if it didn't detect the patterns, if it felt like it was just in regular usage. Okay. And so I think the key here is we just got to be really careful and remember that any sort of benchmark, reporting data, anything, even internally, needs to be used as a data point, not a gospel for how AI performs all the time. Okay. Because when our tests lose trust, which this is kind of what that is, it's a breach in trust. Okay. You're behaving differently based on the evaluation. Then the instinct is to tighten the filter. And I think that's the important part with this, because you kind of see this is where Anthropic's going with it and how they're moving on it is you start to realize like, oh, it's kind of performing to the test. Like, let's lock it down. But saying no more or restricting it more isn't necessarily the answer, which ties to the second insight that stood out to me out of this system report, which is saying no, refusing more isn't inherently the solution. So my goal in bringing this insight to light is to just really reinforce the idea that over refusal, AI telling you no, saying, I'm sorry, I can't do that, type of a thing, does not inherently fix the problem. And in some cases, it might actually undermine safety and trust further. Now, if you look again into the system report, you'll see that it does one of the things, and so this isn't different, it's related. One of the things it talks to is its refusal. That's one of the safety things. How frequently does it refuse? It's part of their testing that they do. And it acknowledges that sometimes, okay, not all the time, but it does give false positives on refusing. It will refuse based on what it's interpreted your question as. And it's consistently higher in its refusal where we want it to, which is good. We don't want it doing certain things, but it also refuses where we don't want it to on a somewhat consistent basis. And if you think, and so going back to my point, if you just keep turning up the like, whoa, it's it's performing data. Let's just have it say no to everything or anything it slightly detects as off. Well, then it can, start to reject things you actually want it engaging with. Just because you reward something for staying silent or not working with something, that's not ethics. That's not building in critical thinking or moral judgment or anything like that. It's just, and this is a very personal one to me, but like, you don't just tell people shut up, don't talk, and think like, wow, hey, look at that. Everybody shut up. What a high performing team. Everybody's in agreement on things. No, they just are silent. They just aren't doing anything. And the risk we run if we keep turning up the volume on refusal is that we start teaching AI that just not saying anything is the right behavior on critical topics. Now, as you can imagine, if it knows it's being tested and gives different responses, or, as we start handing over autonomous decisions to it and then ask questions, why did you do that? We don't want a model that's been reinforced to stay silent on things. And so that's a really important thing because, and the reason I bring this up is there's times you can tweak these models, after the fact, you're going to implement your own things. You want to just be really careful that you don't jump to a conclusion that, hey, it's doing this thing. Let's just roll back or dial up how frequently it refuses to do things. Because there's a big difference between being safe, a model being safe, and it just being scared to engage. And saying no shouldn't be our goal. It's about knowing when and why no is the right decision. So even though refusal can look better and it looks good on the report that refusal is up, they're all scored by their own yardstick. And each company is going to have their own yardstick. And that in itself becomes its own problem, which ties to insight number 3, which is what isn't necessarily in the detail of the safety card, and I want to be really clear about this, is that it does not define all their parameters for how they're measuring these things, which makes sense. They define what those things are. I think it's also important to note, if you go through this document, that these numbers are not based on an industry specific standard. Okay, this is Anthropic's safety scorecard. It's what they call their ASL. And every AI lab has their own safety framework. There is not a global standard necessarily. And so Anthropic has their AI safety levels. It's ASL 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that they evaluate their model against. This one currently right now, Sonnet 4.5 is an ASL 3, which means that the model is manageable and it handles things with manageable risk as long as you have extra monitoring and oversight. So based on the way they evaluate it, they say, yeah, there's some real risk of what this thing can do, but all of it can be monitored with extra monitoring and oversight. There's nothing in here, and what I mean by that, to give some examples, is like, if you ask it to do something that is clearly like, hey, can you help make a bioweapon? It's very effective in saying, hey, like, no, it's not perfect, but it is in their 3 categories, so middle of the line. But it's really important to remember that Anthropic saying it's safe means Anthropic, based on Anthropic's safety measures, says it's safe. So if you hear, Claude or Sonnet is safe or safer, it's like, well, by who or by what standard specifically? Or if you're saying it's low, they can compare it against previous models, but you don't really know the standards by which they really measured that by. You just know it's better than it was before, or it's better by their own standards. So it's really important to remember, whenever you look at any of these AI safety guidelines and guardrails and report cards and all these different things coming out, you need to remember the fact that it's safety by their definition, not yours. And that is a really, really, really important thing to factor in, because safety isn't absolute, it's contextual. And so what may seem safe for Anthropic in your specific use case or what you're trying to do in your industry or your organization or even your personal, activity, that may not be safe. That may be extremely risky and you don't necessarily want to do it. So it's important that their definition of safe will not save you. And I think that's important. If you read through this thing, or if you're trying to evaluate, do we use this model or that model or all these things, that really nothing you see is going to be safe for you. And so keep that in the back of your head whenever you interpret these things. And that was one of the things that immediately jumped out to me as I was digging through this and some of the follow-up questions I had. And if safety is contextuals, I mean, we can't skip the step of leaders and organizations needing to own and define safety for ourselves. We have to define it, staff it. We've got to do all that stuff, which kind of at the halfway point. So it makes sense. Those are the three biggest insights that just didn't necessarily inherently jump off the page that I really wanted to call attention to. But even that, I understand, might be like, okay, cool. This helps me better understand the report, better understand how to think about safety, better understand what I need to consider when evaluating AI and safety for my organization or my personal use. But it's like, so what? What do I do? What do I walk away from in this episode? And there's three things I want to focus on. The first one ties naturally to that last insight, which is if you don't have this today, you need to have this. You have to define, what does safe AI use mean and by what standards? You can't just say safe AI use is this. You have to also say, okay, we need to determine what is the rubric or the measurements around how we're going to determine that. And there needs to be some ownership behind that. Who owns that? If obviously it's personal use, it's you. But if you're a parent, it's you and your spouse, or whoever the guardianship is. If it's an organization, it's whoever is responsible for that. But you need to clarify, what does safety mean for me, my business, my family, things like that. And when you're defining that, I would highly encourage that you're doing that cross-functionally, or with diversity, however you want to think about that. You need to have diverse voices. You need to include different things like that. So you're looking at it through multiple risk angles. You don't want to be defining safety, going back to my point of like, let's just turn up the refusal rating. Well, as an example, if you're doing that and your customer service folks know that, like, a lot of times we get asked this question and technically it violates our policy, but there are unique circumstances by which we have to do this type of thing. You want that information in there so that it doesn't just say, I can't help you, and your person on the other end gets trapped in an infinite loop of AI refusals. But instead it knows, okay, when that happens, these are our typical ways we handle it. This is when we escalate it. This is our process. And so it's more to it than just defining safe, not safe, but also what do you want it to do with that? And you also need to define, what are your non-negotiables and red lines. There are going to be things that you say, no, under no circumstances do we want AI crossing this line. And we keep seeing the AI companies move their line. And I think that's important for you to recognize. There's one I'll be talking about probably in my Q&A this week, that just because AI companies say, which they're still pretty loose about today, what these are our safety standards. Well, those keep changing. They keep saying, we're never going to do this. Well, okay. You know what? Now we decided that that's actually not so bad because it makes us a lot of money. And, now we're going to go into this territory. So their tests were built for their risks, not yours. And you need to keep that in mind, which is why it's so essential that you have a safety framework. You don't need a 150-page governance doc. Well, maybe you do, depending on your company. But not every single person needs to go write their AI safety manifesto. But you can't copy and paste responsibility from someone else, because these definitions are not going to enforce themselves. The people responsible for them will. And what we can see from the models is they don't always even hold up to their own standards, which ties to action point number 2, which is, I hear the phrase all the time, we need to keep people in the loop. And I largely agree with and like that statement. Yes, we do. We need people in the loop around AI systems, overseeing AI systems, all that stuff. But it's incomplete in that it's not just about having a human in the loop somewhere. It's about having the right humans in the right loops at the right times. And that's often what gets missed. The organizations will set things up so that a human checks things off at the end. I see this all the time in software engineering where the code gets all written and it gets pushed down the line to somebody at the end. Go, hey, can you just validate this stuff? At that point, it's gone too far and people can't keep up with it. So it's not just having a human in the loop. It's not just throwing a bunch of humans in the loop. It's about having the right ones, the ones who know in that specific stage at this specific time with a mix of technical and domain expertise placed intentionally and surgically along the line of whatever you're doing, so they have contextual judgment. So it doesn't get to the end and the one person who knows maybe 60% of the things it should be looking out for is responsible for looking out for 100%. That stuff should be caught further up the chain by the people who would have the judgment and wisdom to do it and can filter that stuff out, which means they also need to have the authority to pause things and say, hey, we got to stop right here. We can't move this forward. It doesn't do any good to put people in the loop if ultimately you strip away any sort of authority or autonomy that they may have to actually hit the brakes and say, no, we actually need to pause. We need to course correct because we're seeing AI drift off, or we just saw something concerning we haven't seen before. We need to do some further investigation before we just charge forward with that. And that requires the right people in the right places at the right times with the right level of authority to actually do something. And I'm telling you right now, context is not optional. It's not something we can bank on AI having. It is its greatest weakness is that it does not have context, no matter how good it is at picking up patterns. It is a machine. It is an algorithm simply looking at pattern recognition. It does not understand why it's doing what it's doing, even if it can see all the different possibilities of what could happen. And having that human context is the difference between making a quick course correction and having a quiet, unseen catastrophe blow up in your face. So walking away from that, remember, it's not just a human in the loop. It's not just more humans in the loop. It's the right ones at the right place at the right time with the right context, with the right level of authority to do something about it. Now, even with great people, with great context, great all this stuff, great authority, all these things, this is not something when it comes to safety and AI usage that you can set and forget. So just because you set up, you defined your standards, you did a great job with that, you have robust, diverse, widely contextual standards that are well-defined and measured. You've now put the right people in the right place at the right loops. You've done all these things. You're thinking through all this stuff. You don't go, we did it. We did it and we're done and we can now go back to things as usual. This is about ongoing monitoring and adapting. And I think if anything, the safety card really brings this to light, because if you look at how these things are changing model over model and the speed at which the models are changing, all it takes is, especially as we become more dependent on AI models, but this was true with people as well, that you flip a setting, things change radically. And with the level of involvement AI has on things and the implications of even a slight adjustment to its training frameworks and the way it's used, you can see this thing flip on its head very quickly. And so having institutionalized vigilance and iteration built in is essential. This is not set it and forget it. This is something where you build those measures in place. You have things ongoing to examine this kind of stuff. You make sure that, hey, is it still performing safely as we originally intended? Are we seeing things shift? Because models are going to evolve. Your business is going to evolve. things are going to evolve around the way you do things, and you're going to need to adjust as you move. And you're going to need to iterate on that. You can't just say, well, it worked for us last year, so it should be fine. And this is something when it comes to resourcing, a lot of times this does not get built into the plan. And so as an application, this is something that all of you need to plan for. Even on an individual level, you need to be constantly building in space to be reevaluating, hey, how is this stuff working? And is it still working for me in a safe and effective way? Which means continuous red teaming, review cycles, like tracking on your dashboards of whatever those dashboards are, personal, professional, organizational, and looking for the leading and lagging indicators of what's happening. You need to catch this stuff early, but then you also need to be watching what happens afterwards, because you don't really know until it's actually moving, and something might shift in a slight way that you don't realize the indications of what's going to happen until it's too late, which really builds all this stuff up where, just because you have a really great safety framework and you have the right people where you need them, welcome to the starting line is really what I would say. Is AI safety isn't the finish line. It's a moving target. I wouldn't even say it's the starting line. It's like a moving target. The course and the route is changing on a constant basis. And so you need to build that into your budget, into your timelines, into all of these things, because just because AI may have been safe yesterday, maybe just because last week it was passing everything with flying colors and you didn't detect anything going wrong, this week something could have changed. The slight ways in which AI is being used, the way it's been built, the adjustment on the model level could completely bend that. And while, yes, looking at the safety cards and the system cards, a lot of times that movement is not always being captured, and it looks like it's moving in a positive direction. Okay, I will say that. It does look like we're continuing to move in a positive direction. But if one thing I've observed in the work that I do and looking at a lot of these research and data reports and all these different things I look at, is the fact that there's always trade-offs. There's always uncertain things that don't necessarily get brought to light and all this other stuff. And as an example, what this whole episode was about was this idea that it knows it's being tested and it gives a different response. Well, so if your dashboards that you historically had consistently start going up, hey, look, it's getting better. Is it really getting better? Or is it getting better because it knows what you're looking at? And as a result is making sure those things are being greenlit because it knows those are the patterns that are the path of least resistance. And again, this is not about a model being nefarious and scheming behind you, even though that's a lot of the buzzword terminology that gets thrown around with this stuff. It's just picking up on the pattern and delivering what it thinks you want. And that's the biggest thing to remember. Is it's giving you what it thinks you want and what is its best determination for accomplishing that, which sometimes is not actually in your best interest. But you won't know that if you aren't regularly checking in and monitoring and making sure it's doing what you need it to do. Now, that's a lot, and I acknowledge that. And some of this may feel new and overwhelming. And I get that. I feel like that every week when I go through these things, and some of the feedback I get from you all as a community is like, Christopher, this just feels like a lot to take in. And it is. But as an encouraging point, it is different, but it's also not. A lot of this may sound like all new stuff, but it's also work that's very familiar, which should bring some comfort to you in the sense that, yeah, it's complex. Yes, there's nuance to how exactly you may need to navigate this or the speed by which you need to navigate it. And that is true. However, the tools may have changed, the methods may have changed, but the guiding principles behind this, everything I talked about today, having clear safety frameworks for the work you do, that's not something anybody ever goes, wow, I hope not. I hope nobody goes, boy, I never considered safety in any of the work that I do before. Hope you're doing that. So that's not new. Defining what safe means and how we measure that, and ongoing monitoring of that. You, you likely have systems and processes in place to do that. You just need to now expand or adjust them to accommodate this new set of tools and this new way of working. This stuff is not repeating, but it rhymes. There's familiarity to what we're doing here. And if you do it right and you have clarity and you include the right people and you stay humble and don't think like we've got this all figured out, because anybody who tells you they've got it all figured out, they're lying to you. Okay. Even the experts, the experts of the experts of the experts that I know, they'll tell you we still don't know a lot about behind us. And even in the safety card, they acknowledge that where things go in unexpected directions, they can't they say that we think this is what it is. We think this is why it's doing this, but we can't necessarily confirm that. And that's the challenge of the black box. But the leaders who do all these things aren't just going to be ones that keep up. They'll be the leaders that guide AI and use AI to help take us somewhere that's worth going. So there you go. If you would you do me a favor? If you and your organization would benefit from perspective and guidance like this, if something that I just talked about or anything that I do really lands with you or somebody you know, go ahead and send me an email. Book a time at Christopher Lynn Co. And I'm committed to helping leaders navigate this moment because it is a lot and the stakes are high, but we can do this well. So I'm Christopher Lind. This has been Future Focused. And with that, we will see you on the other side.